Vice President Pence is the chair. I don't have anything else to say about that. But Chris Kobach, who's the Secretary of State of Kansas, is the vice chair. And he has a long history of being someone who is seeking to limit access to voter registration and voting. So I think that's a problem. And then, while it has nothing probably to do with electoral process, to my mind, this commission is made up of 11 white men. And it just seems to me in 2017 that maybe you ought to be able to create a commission with a little different demographics than that, but that's just a personal piece that I couldn't resist to say. Critics of this commission, though, have said from the outset that one of its purposes is to limit access to voting, to make it more difficult to register and more difficult to vote. And it seems to me that that is the issue that's especially important to the League of Women Voters and others. So as you all know, one of the first actions prompted by Vice Chair Kobach was to request a lot of information from states about voting in the 2016 election. Information that most of them had, some maybe partial social security numbers, but the date of birth of people who voted, their names and addresses. In some states, their political affiliation is available, because you've got to register as belonging to a certain party, and their voting history. And by that I mean, we don't know who they voted for. We're supposed to be secret, but which elections they have voted in the past. So a lot of this is public, and it's on rolls. Other had to be gathered, and that's a problem. And the clear goal, I think, of the commission was to take that information and look at it in comparison with other federal information, such as immigration information and customs revenue information, to see if there are obvious discrepancies there that might be evidence of voter fraud. But in reality, the request has been hugely controversial, and in part, I think, as much as a statement about voting rights, it makes a statement about how nervous we all are now about our personal data and whose hands it gets in. So while it was work for these various state agencies, usually secretaries of state, to gather the information in some way that made sense, what really became a big drain on their time and money was the number of people who contacted them worried about their personal data and what was going to happen to that, so they had to make assurances that that was okay. And the number of people who sought to remove themselves from the voting rolls so that then their personal data would no longer be available.
Wow.
Which seems to me, first of all, to be counterintuitive when, like, my intellectual framework is that voting means equality, so we want people to vote, so we shouldn't make it harder for them to vote, we should make it easier to vote. The Associated Press has found that, and I don't want to do a long discussion of the legalities of it, but 15 states have just refused to provide the requested information. So what that means, if you're really into statistics and data, much like myself, is that you really do not have any of the comparative information you need with the other databases in the government, because we got 50 states and Puerto Rico and whatever. And if 15 say no, then you don't, your sample no longer is appropriate. It's also the case that a number of people have sued the commission and entities seeking information about their work because they're a presidential commission. And none of that has been forthcoming. They've sued them under Freedom of Information Act, where you're supposed to have 20 days to respond, no responses. Several Democratic senators have said, basically, what the heck is this commission doing? No responses. So that's kind of a problem. And the other example that people are talking a lot about is that Chris Kobach said New Hampshire is a good example, which didn't go the way that President Trump hoped it would, of voter fraud. And he used as the proof of this that there were, look at 6,540 people who registered in same-day registration in New Hampshire, and they had out-of-state driver's licenses as their form of ID. So according to Kobach, that was prima facie evidence that voter fraud took place in New Hampshire. Except, we've talked about how states get to have laws about elections. In New Hampshire, if you're a full-time student, you are allowed to vote in New Hampshire. Well, we live in a university community. We got a number of out-of-state students who probably have out-of-state driver's licenses, and that was the case in New Hampshire. So those folks who were students, who had out-of-state driver's licenses, were entitled to vote. New Hampshire also makes it legal if you are an active duty member of the United States Armed Forces, you're entitled to vote in New Hampshire. And you may very well have an out-of-state driver's license because your home's in Idaho and you happen to be stationed in New Hampshire, right? So once you take that into account, there really is no evidence of voter fraud even in New Hampshire. And the kicker of all this, once again, we're in a university community, is how people register and then vote. So you come to school at the University of Idaho. You've got two choices when you vote. You could vote absentee at your home, if you're 18 or 19, like where you live with your parents. Or you can register to vote in Moscow, in Idaho, because you live here and you get to vote. The thing is, see, you might want to write this down. You aren't supposed to vote in both of those places. You only get to vote in one of them. But, put yourself in the place of the 18-year-old who comes here. They may very well have registered and voted at home, because they get to do that when they're 18, and a lot of them were 18 in November or some part of at least their senior year, right? They voted there, they registered. They came here, they got involved in campus Republicans, and they wanted to be able to vote in Idaho, right? So they registered to vote here. Well, how many of them think notified the folks in Timbuktu, Alaska, that I'm no longer gonna vote here, because I'm a big-time college student now, and I'm gonna vote in Moscow, Idaho? Probably not many of them. It is the job of states to scrub their election rolls of folks who, this is a very mobile society of people who move away, but it's not that easy. But then my question is to those of you who may have children or grandchildren or big students yourself, how many of those 18-year-olds are gonna do an absentee ballot in Alaska and vote in Moscow, which they probably could do and probably not get caught, but are they really gonna do that? First of all, most Americans take voting really seriously and they're not gonna do that, and secondly, they probably don't know how to do that or are not inclined to do that, or the chances of them doing that are very minuscule. So as you probably read, one of Tiffany Trump, I almost forgot her name. How can you forget that name?